So we can start our next conversation with Polish Cinema for Beginners. Here is Radio Wrocław Kultura, and we are talking about what Poles do in the shadow. And here is with us Adam Kruk, film critic and programmer of Polish Cinema for Beginners. Hi, Adam.
Hello.
And also we are happy to have Kuba Żary with us, behalf of Polish Cinema for Beginners. Hello, Kuba.
Hello.
So, what actually Poles do in the shadow?
Well, they do what any other kind of people do. It's not about what they do. It's more about the shadows and whether they talk about it or not, whether they show their private life openly, or it's sex and erotism. Is it still a taboo in Polish cinema?
Yeah, but is it just Polish cinema and Polish society is on other side, or you are trying to talk about what Polish cinema shows to the viewers, or just to show what the society is and what taboos in this society are?
Of course, sex is always representing a bigger part of life. It's always political also. So if we're talking about Poland, maybe we're not that different from other countries that were on the eastern side of Iron Curtain before, where sex for almost 50 years was much tabularized, and there were certain ways to show it on the screen in the different periods of film history.
So maybe we should start with 1989 as a symbolic relief, the end of prudery?
Not necessarily, because in the 80s, for instance, we already have video cassettes and there were a lot of pornography around. It's just that it was always hidden, and even sex was, there were certain ways to show it on the screen, if we're not talking about the blue movies. Of course. So it was changing through the decades. If you're watching, for instance, Polish movies from the 50s, there's basically no sex. And also love is always used.
Super symbolic, right?
Yeah, it's used to spread a certain ideology. In the movies from the 50s, those realistic movies, usually the main character, of course, man, has to choose between honest girl from village or working class.
And this man you are talking about, he was strong and probably a soldier with like a tough face, like very square.
Much often. So it's even love was used as a symbol of bigger thing than love itself, the ideology. Then in the late 50s, when we're talking about Polish film school, also like Ashes and Diamonds by Wajda is the best example, when Zbigniew Cybulski, the protagonist, has to choose between a girl, love, and a country, and his ideas, and this is the motif which is present in many Polish movies, which didn't treat love and sex as something important. The history, the country, those were the things that the great directors were talking about usually.
But if you'd have to choose or point out the milestones or iconic moments in Polish cinema history for the image of intimacy or the image of sex, what titles would you choose? What titles would you think about in this context?
Chronologically.
Of course, the 70s was the time where things changed. We didn't have 68 as in Western countries, like hippies, free love. Of course not. But we had those fashions were somehow present a little bit later. And in the 70s, we already have a lot of erotic movies, or movies where there's more eroticism. Even Andrzej Wajda Wajda created a promised land in this period with a famous scene where Kalina Jędrusik, a sex bomb of this time, is giving a blowjob to Daniel Olbryski. Then after years, Wajda decided to cut this scene out of the movie, but it shows that it was always there. And in the 70s, and the 70s are the time of directors such as Walerian Borowczyk or Andrzej Żuławski. Those two names, I would say, are the most erotic Polish directors. But what's funny, most of their movies were made in France, which of course shows how prude was Polish cinema back then.
I would like to go back to the subject that you touched upon a few minutes ago when Krzysiek said that maybe we should treat 1989 as a kind of a border between the prudish cinema and maybe the more open, liberated, naughty cinema. You didn't really agree with that. So would you say that which one was more free in that kind of territory, the cinema before 1989 or after 1989?
In fact, there were many similarities in presenting human body, for instance, between 80s and the 90s. In the 80s, of course, we had a lot of films with sex bomb of this period, such as Kasia Figura or Grażyna Szapołowska, who almost in every movie showed her magnificent body. But then in the 90s, the cinema was much alike in presenting women and men in the movie. So, like, it was always good to have a naked lady in the movie, but with a male nudity, it was very risky, and it came to the screen later.
We've chosen in Polish Cinema for Beginners season 14 for this subject. We've chosen the movie United States of Love by Tomasz Wasilewski. It is quite a recent title. You've been telling in this conversation a lot about 70s, 80s, 90s, and how is it intimacy portrayed right now in Polish cinema? How did it change since the beginning of the century?
Well, I think like the film want to kind of fill those gaps in Polish cinema and want to investigate why Polish cinema was so shy in a way. Many things changed. Tomasz Wasilewski is a new generation of Polish directors, so you could see that his way of looking is totally different. It's connected with the revolution that we have in the 90s and the years 2000, also in theater, for instance, where Jacek Poniedziałek, for example, was playing Hamlet totally naked, and when he was doing it in the play, some people on the audience were screaming, "Oh, put your pants on!" But today we are more used to also seeing male body on the screen. We have it also in United States of Love, or also older bodies that are not usually on the covers of the Playboy magazine, but we don't want to hide them anymore, because what is here to hide?
Radio Wrocław Kultura in collaboration with Polish Cinema for Beginners. This is the second conversation about Polish cinema. Now we are talking about Polish intimacy and sexuality based on video essay which was published on PCfB's social media pages earlier this week. It was mostly about United States of Love, but also in bigger perspective, can we try to answer for the question if the Polish cinema was better to describe this subject as a comedy or maybe as a drama? Because when I asked you a first question about taboo sexuality in cinema, all of us has laughed, and probably this is the easier way to communicate sexuality and intimacy.
We have Sex Mission, and one
Yeah.
of the
Finest movie.
finest and most known and most loved Polish movie from the early 80s. But watching Sex Mission, which still is very funny and appealing. It's not actually about sex. It's very little sexy movie. You have some scenes, but in many ways it's more about gender. And of course it's funny, and the success, the enormous success of the movie shows that people are actually very interested in sex, and Polish cinema very rarely takes this opportunity. Yet last year the movie 365 days was a great success, and now it's on Netflix all over the world, being even more successful. But this movie, it's more like it doesn't show sex in very honest way. It's more about idealization of some fantasies. Maybe let's not talk about rape culture, because this movie is very dangerously
glamorizing it, I think.
Yeah, but it also shows that sex, of course, sells.
Yeah, I think when you say that it was a huge success, we should clarify that it was a commercial success more than a critical one, because it didn't win any critical acclaim across the globe. It's and I say across the globe because really 365 days is a global success in that commercial sense. It was in the top 3 movies on Netflix in many countries for many weeks, and I think in American market it's broke some records of how long the movie was in the top 3 on Netflix. You were talking about Sex Mission a few seconds ago, and I remember when we showed that movie in the first season of Polish Cinema for Beginners, maybe second. Joanna Ostrowska was the expert on that screening, and she said that there is a story about this movie being shown abroad, being shown in the States, and that it was protested against by the feminist groups. Is the way we view sex now more in sync with the rest of the Western world, let's say, or are we still catching up? And I would like to go back here to United States of Love, because it shows for very specific 90s.
Maybe we did catch up a little, yet there are still films that are being very controversial. I remember the time in the 90s when movies were showing, film theaters were showing a movie called The Priest by Antonia Bird, and there were literally people protesting in front of cinemas against the movie. It was a movie about a gay priest. So this, I think, sexuality and religion is still very dangerous. You could see that lately with documentaries on pedophilia in the Polish church. That was really big. Of course, it wasn't in the cinemas, but on YouTube. But that was something that really warmed up the public opinion. So there are still subjects that that actually can
Fire up the public.
yeah, and but not only, of course, in Poland. Last year, there was famous case in Georgia, the movie called "And Then We Danced" about gay dancers who are dancing the traditional Georgian dance, which was big success abroad in Georgia. Also big success, but also very controversial movie, also protested by some people, which in fact weren't even an audience, because usually people who are protesting at a movie are refusing to even see it. So yes, sex and religion, sex and nationality might be a very dangerous combination.
Do you think there is a Polish way to show sex in the cinema, in the movies? Because when I think about, let's say, Almodovar, there is a very particular way to show sex, intimacy, emotions, and relationships. And maybe there is a director or a national way to show sex, intimacy, and emotions here in Poland.
I don't think there's a national way, but if you look at certain directors, you could see the style. For example, if you see the first movies by Agnieszka Holland, which is one of the biggest directors now in Poland, A Woman Alone or Heat, the sex is so sad there that you could cry watching the sex scenes. They are like really nightmarish.
But it's really similar to Tomasz Wasilewski's United States of Love.
Yeah. But the film is sad, but I would say the nudity, the sex is quite natural and well, maybe not joyful, but try to watch A Woman Alone or Heat with it. But then again, we had directors such as Kazimierz Kuc. We were showing his Nobody's Calling on Polish Cinema for Beginners a few years ago. And in many of his movies, sex is treated as something really joyful, really vital, vibrant, and always present. I've mentioned before Andrzej Żuławski, who was one of my favorite Polish directors, and also a person very interested in love, sex, and sometimes disturbing human relations.
We are running out of time, so maybe we can summarize all you said today. So is it really bad? Is it fine? Or is it great? With, of course, Polish cinema and sex and intimacy and emotions and relationships shown in these movies.
I would say it's getting better. We're being more open about things. I mentioned in the video essay that, for instance, homosexuality is not a taboo anymore, or sex of people who are not in their 20s or 30s is being present. Also, we can see that Polish cinema tries to understand not only men's desire, but also women's desire, which is quite important. So me watching contemporary Polish movies, I get to see much more interesting images, not being insulted every time with or scared with the sex scenes when sometimes people were making sex in their underwear. Well, it doesn't happen anymore. Yeah.
Adam Kruk, a film critic, thank you very much, and Kuba Żary, who is going to tell us about our next conversation. When and what?
Our next conversation will be on 24th of July, and it will be about Polish family and what happens between four walls. So see you then, and thank you for being with us today at Polish Cinema for Beginners Season 14 at Radio Wrocław Kultura.